we are happy to have you. Mr. Bright Simons is with Imani Ghana and does many other things. But today he's speaking to us about state capture. Bright, if you can hear me, over to you, and please talk to us. I think you have 15 minutes or so to speak to us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof, for a very warm welcome. And my gratitude to CDD. I note that the Executive Director of Imani has also joined us. So this is a full-fledged Imani team, at least both in the physical realm as well as in the moral realm, delivering these remarks for the benefit of the audience. Obviously, the subject matter is of great interest, and I note that some of the partners that have come together, including the University of Ghana Business School that Prof represents, and the World Bank, have been working together for many years to try and resolve this. My mission is fairly simple. I hope that I can be heard loud and clear in the hall. I'm here to discuss one dimension of corruption, and that is state capture. I also hope that my screen is visible. Wonderful, Prof. So to start off, I think there is an intuitive feel for what state capture means, because we do see uncritical use of the term in the public media, in the general press, and perhaps even in ordinary conversation. So I have, put on the screen a recent provocative front page article by Africa Watch, where the view was that the entire country of Ghana was luxuriating in state capture. We've also seen, placards of demonstrations in the country where the state capture term has been on clear display. I think, though, that when you look at the uncritical use of the term, it tends to be confused somewhat with grand corruption generally. So some people will argue that, the famous Woyomi scandal that sprang onto our public imagination and consciousness but a decade ago is an element, a species, it's an example of state capture. As we proceed further in this conversation, to be clear that, to keep the term meaningful, we have to be somewhat stricter than perhaps necessary, and not regard any instance of grand corruption as state capture. So, for instance, Woyomi will not be an example of state capture. And I guess, as I explain further down the line, it will be clear why that is not. The truth, of course, is that there's a very sophisticated history of inquiry behind this notion of state capture. And we have a person of no mean stature than Dr. Kaufman himself, one of the pioneers of this line of inquiry in our midst. And even though I mentioned one or two aspects of the work that he and others within the World Bank and elsewhere have done, I do not intend at all to steal his thunder. I'll have to clarify, though, that when we think of that sophisticated line of inquiry around state capture, which I'll mention in a moment, we do get it entangled somewhat with other concepts from the Western tradition, both from the Western sociological tradition as well as the Western political tradition, about illiberalism and authoritarianism, etc. And you will find that typically in the literature that is before this particular strain of World Bank literature got on the scene around the turn of the millennium, you will see that state capture was heavily implicated in authoritarianism, illiberalism, the idea of the state being unaccountable and stuff like that. And it's not too surprising because when you really look at the particular strain of state capture literature that I'm going to discuss in a second, the one that was pioneered at the World Bank, you do see that it's happening in parts of the world that had been under authoritarian control for many, many years, for decades, in fact, such as in the post-Soviet space. So the fact that, illiberalism, authoritarianism, etc., gets entangled with state capture is understandable from the Western point of view. Now, we have, of course, this fascinating phenomenon in Africa where some of the countries that are fairly democratic by every measure, so Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and the rest, are also places where you see very elevated levels of state capture, sometimes higher than you see in authoritarian states like Rwanda or Mauritania or elsewhere. So it's very interesting that, in one of the ways in which we intend to proceed, we intend to break from the Western conceptualization of this phenomenon. And one of those approaches is to say that the liberalism authoritarian link does not really foster much understanding of the African condition. And we'll come back to this difference between Africa and elsewhere in a minute. Another thriving literature, which we will not delve into, but which also provides us with some of the intellectual heritage for the discussion we are about to have, is the one about elite capture, which tends to be very prominent in South Asia, in parts of the Middle East and elsewhere. I don't have the time to take you through the elite capture literature, but it's also a very interesting species of analysis and inquiry that has a role to play if you want to understand the origins, the intellectual origins of this phenomenon of state capture. So now having gone on this ridiculous detour, I'm beginning to hone in on some home truths. Yes, around 1997, the World Bank got this invitation, but I'm pretty sure they were also very excited themselves to recommend themselves to the CIS countries, the post-Soviet transition economies in Eastern Europe and in Eurasia, around this phenomenon of corruption, which was getting out of hand. And around that period, you will begin to see very interesting framing of state capture begin to emerge, because the evidence before our eyes in those days was very stark in those parts of the world. Why? Because if you think of it, the Soviet Union and its vassal states in the Warsaw Pact and elsewhere had been primarily state-owned, had primarily run state-run economies, state-owned and run economies. And then they very rapidly privatized. Some of you remember the famous shock therapy, where some people that today are more considered to be more on the left of the global ideological spectrum, like Professor Jeffrey Sachs and others, were involved in rapid privatization across that part of the world. So all of a sudden, you had countries without a culture of private sector conduct having to run private sector corporations that previously have been state-run corporations. It wasn't surprising then that a lot of these corporations continue to behave as if, they were still state-managed entities, in the sense that the entanglement between the owners, the so-called oligarchs in the case of Russia and elsewhere, the Russian Federation and elsewhere, had themselves typically come from positions within the political establishments. Some of them had been operatives in the intelligence service and elsewhere. They come now to run businesses. So having come to run businesses, it's not surprising that they will attempt to co-opt the state into furthering their private interest. So this was a very fertile ground for developing this theory and this concept of state capture. I think that it was developed to the point where it was impressively empirical. And I see some of the work that, at that time captured the imagination of scholars around the world. And Prof, you've mentioned that you yourself was a devotee of this species of literature. And one of the things that made it beautiful was how empirical it was and how you could compare countries based on how state capture had pervaded public life or business life and to what extent. In the West, we've always had this ideological minefield around the role of big corporations. And I think if you are speaking to Western observers of this phenomenon, they will mention that the military-industrial complex in the United States, certain major pharmaceutical corporations in places like Switzerland and Western Europe are engaged in the phenomenon of state capture. And they will have various arguments that they will make. I think that we should not get distracted by some of those parallels. And I hope that I'll be able to explain that in Africa, we have a unique phenomenon that we need to grapple with. I think that part of the reason why the classical framing of state capture does not work too well when you are trying to describe the situation as it pertains in Africa, and particularly in Ghana, which is obviously our primary interest in this endeavor that we are currently engaged in. If you think of it, the private sector, even compared to the transition economies, has never been as well defined for a very long time. And by what do I mean by that? What I mean is that when you think of the broader private sector, the informality that had characterized the wider private sector in Africa tended to overshadow the small formal institutions that perhaps are similar to what you find in the transition economies and certainly what you find in the OECD countries. So even at its most underdeveloped, the private sector in the transition countries, in Romania, in Bulgaria, in the Russian Federation, in Kazakhstan, elsewhere, was still predominantly formal. So I was looking at some of the statistics over the years as I was preparing for this talk, and they never attained the level of informality that we've seen in Africa of 70%, 80% informality across the private sector. That's very, very significant. That's significant also because it created certain conditions in which for a long time the private sector in Africa was perceived as composed of victims. So we saw the private sector in Africa as one that was experiencing repression and suppression. And most of our concern was around the crowding out of the private sector. So think about it. Around 1997, 98, all the way to 2001, this whole classical framing of state capture in the World Bank tradition was taking shape. In Ghana, the concern was not about big corporations that had oligarchs at the helm and which were trying to co-opt the state to further their private interests. A lot of the concern around 1997 to 2001 in Ghana was about the private sector being crowded out due to government policies of financial repression, due to policies that disfavor private enterprise. So it is very difficult to see the specific conditions of Ghana placed against the canvas that have been created in the classical framing. Private sector was not seen as threatening. It was not seen as engaged in any activity that could be considered oligarchic or could be considered as state capture in that classical framing. And that has continued until maybe I would say around the first, the turn of the first decade of the 21st century, when the likes of, big companies like RLG, Zoomlion, and the rest with large government contracts in Ghana started to surface. And then some of these conversations slowly trickled into the public consciousness. Given that our concerns was about a private sector that had been emaciated, a private sector that had been repressed, a private sector that had been suppressed, a private sector that had been crowded out by government policies around fiscal mismanagement, etc., high borrowing costs for government that made it impossible then for private sector to borrow because the government has set certain benchmarks, etc. Given those concerns, given those factors in play, it's not surprising that state capture was never well defined in our context and never had the same ideological appeal that they had in the transition economies and certainly in certain ideological factions in the OECD. I would say that created conditions in which this phenomenon of state capture carefully, subtly, perniciously invaded our landscape without us paying too much attention. I think it was a bit of a honeypot trap in that we all went gung-ho in supporting the private sector, talking about how the private sector was underdeveloped, talking about how the private sector was repressed, and talking about how the conditions had to be created to enable the flourishing of the private sector. And so while the state capture elements were evolving, we're completely non-vigilant. We lack the vigilance that elsewhere, as part of intellectual traditions and as part of projects, intellectual projects of different kind, academic projects of different kind, and will have enabled us to become more alert to the emergence of this phenomenon. I also think that the way in which state capture has manifested itself has been such that it's really not often presented in the forms of private sector advancement that sometimes apologists for state business strategic interactions often do in, say, Nigeria, where when you talk about Dangote or Bua, you see a lot of Nigerians say, no, we think that this is a Nigerian champion. And even though they may get dollars at lower, a far lower price than some SME will get it, we think that, a multi-billion-dollar champion such as Dangote deserves it. Or if you talk to people in Morocco or Egypt or country, and they see these big private sector conglomerates as national champions. I think in our case, that's not how generally they've been presented. In a lot of the examples and the case studies that I'm going to present to you, in fact, the private sector aspect itself has been suppressed. In some cases, I would say that it's been obfuscated and in some cases, a subterfuge. So you have a private sector partner or a private sector player actively using all the resources of the state, all the power of the state to advance a particular interest. But that interest is wholly presented as national interest. And to the point where it is done without even regard for the private sector benefits that may be accruing. So we don't even acknowledge it. And that has created a very different situation on our hands. So I think that rather than state capture, the situation as it persists in Ghana, as it pertains in Ghana, is better described as state enchantment. We've been enchanted and into not even seeing it. And I will bet you, those of you in the hall are people of eminent standing in society. You have immense knowledge. But the way in which I'm going to frame these case studies will shock you. It will shock you primarily because you will disagree with the characterization, some of which will be due principally to the fact that you've never really paid attention to what has occurred over the last couple of years. And if that is indeed the case, then I will have succeeded in my task of portraying this as state enchantment. One of the elements, so there are key elements of state enchantment. One of them is, of course, the fact that the population, the citizenry, have been jujufied. You know, this state enchantment involves elements of juju. And this juju operates in such a manner in which private interest is presented to the public as universal aspirations of the citizens. There are elements in which the private and the public are so blurred that actually people do not see the distinction at all. And often they are not even aware of the private underpinnings of that state agenda. So the state agenda, and there's no doubt there's clear state agenda. What I'm saying is that whereas in the national military industrial complex context of the United States, whereas in the Dangote industrialization context of Nigeria, whereas in the Roche or Novartis context of Switzerland, people are very alert to what the private sector is contributing, and they may have ideological differences as to whether that is net positive or net negative. I'm arguing that in the case of Ghana, in the case of some African countries, it's presented in such a way that you're not even aware of the underlying private sector interest. I also say that sometimes you go to the extent where we have been so jujufied, we have been so enchanted that we look and we don't even see. So there's no point to subterfuge. If you actually did look, it will be very blatant and very obvious, but you don't even bother to look. So many sections of the population then become so wedded to the public and official narrative that activists or advocates like, you know, those of us at Imani that try to shine light on it are completely disregarded. We have absolutely no traction because people don't even understand what we are talking about, and you just don't have the time and the incentive to delve into it. And consistently, these national projects, which I argue are examples and actually high points of state enchantment, they are presented in the imagery of national success, as in they become examples of how Ghana has truly thrived. So let's go on and then go through these case studies very quickly. As Ghana Card, a few of you who follow me on Twitter knows this is one of my pet projects, my pet subjects, and I've been talking about it a lot. And it is true that, before you came to this session, somebody had told you that one of the first examples that we are going to use to demonstrate and to illustrate the prevalence of state capture in the Ghanaian setting was Ghana Card. You've been completely mystified, perhaps even stupefied. So bear with me for a moment as I try to explain. Most people don't realize that the Ghana Card initiative is actually a public-private partnership. A few do, and those of you in this room, I presume, predominantly do, but in the general public, they think it's a Ghana government project alone. So it's a public-private initiative. The private sector component is known as IMS, and IMS more or less owns the technological infrastructure. They own the servers, they own the software, they have the licenses for the encryption and the cryptography. They own everything about the technology. And the government is responsible for the logistics. So NIA, the National Identification Authority, has offices, it has personnel, it has some cars, it hires some people temporarily, and then it rolls out this registration using technology provided to them by the private sector. What is interesting, though, is that the whole mechanism, the whole national identification mechanism, have been so designed that it's not possible for the NIA to print the card anywhere else except through this private operator. So the private partner is the only one who prints the cards. And so the government, so this is very different from most other places where you have national ID card produced and the like. Like if you go to Malaysia, the government owns the infrastructure. They may hire contractors to work on it, but it's the government that is the ultimate backstopper. It owns the IP, it owns the infrastructure, it controls the data. It also determines who prints the cards. And in the case of Malaysia, they will run a tender, and whichever company wins, the printing company that wins the tender, then gets access to the encrypted data and all of that configuration, a set of configurations in order to generate genuine ID cards. In Ghana, that's not the case. In Ghana, more or less, the country is bound to continue to receive the cards only from one vendor, which is the vendor that has entered into this long-term agreement with the government. Because it's the only vendor that can produce the card. If that company was to go bankrupt tomorrow, and of course we pray to God that that never happens, literally Ghana will not have a Ghana card again because of the fact that the licenses that subsist, that gives Ghana access to some of the high tech components of the system, some of the licenses for cryptography and the rest of it, all inhered within this company. This company has the licenses in its name. It's also the case that the PPP that was signed guarantees the consortium $1.2 billion over the life of the program. Essentially, the government committed that through this effort, we would generate $1.2 billion. Now, this is very unusual. You probably will never find another example anywhere in the world where something that is normally perceived as a public good, an identification card for citizens, also involve a guaranteed return, which must be made. So one of the reasons why consistently the government tries to force people to use the Ghana card is because they need the volumes. They need people to actually get the cards. Why? Because every time you get the card, the government pays money to the consortium. And because the government pays money to the consortium, it needs a lot of volume for it to make sense. Otherwise, they're not going to hit the $1.2 billion. The other thing that you also have to realize is that because they needed the volumes, they needed to assure these volumes. They literally sent laws into parliament forcing the country and the citizens in the country to use the national card for everything. You can't have a bank account without it. You can't register to, in fact, they even tried to prevent people from registering to vote if they didn't have the Ghana card and the Ghana card alone. And when you listen to the analysis, none of it makes sense in terms of why it should be only the Ghana card, because how you get the Ghana card is no more rigorous or stringent than how you get a passport or some other ID card. In fact, the majority of people who got a Ghana card use the guarantor system. Somebody shows up and says that this person is someone that I know, and that is the only basis for which they have the Ghana card. As for why that is superior to the passport, they don't have to explain it to you. Because as I've tried to explain, the reason why it's being driven is not primarily because the government is so keen on national security and the rest of course, that is a secondary benefit. But you must understand the rational motivation behind forcing you to use only the Ghana card. It got to the point where, as part of the strategy and having made laws to back it, the government then said you couldn't vote without having the Ghana card. And unfortunately for the government, it owed the contractor. It hadn't made some of the payments. Why? Because, as I said, the contractor had been guaranteed certain minimum income. And now that income is tied to estimations of how much it's likely to recoup from the sale of the cards. So it had delivered a number of cars, a couple of millions of cars to the government, and the government had not been able to pay the money because, the strategy was around a lot of the money being made by state entities paying to verify the card. But the card was not yet available. Many of the state entities were refusing to pay because they didn't have the money. They hadn't budgeted for it. And remember that this company had budgeted to receive nearly $500 million from different state agencies verifying the card. And that was not, anywhere close to the reality on the ground. In fact, in some instances, because of competition among different private sector interests, the Ministry of Communications had prevented the use of the verification mechanism for the SIM card registration. So the ministry has said you can only use the Ghana card, which is, of course, national policy. But when it came to the verification, the Ministry of Communication had a preferred private sector vendor, another company, which was handling the systems for collecting the biometric. And to allow the Ghana card vendor to come in will have meant that that particular commercial relationship will be disrupted. So, in fact, all of these things had meant, therefore, that the money that was supposed to come was not coming as fast enough. And the government was then because the government had guaranteed, the government was then on the tab for paying these amounts. Unfortunately, the government had not paid. So when this matter then went to Parliament, luckily, the opposition in Parliament used the excuse of the fact that not enough people had the cards. And of course, the reason why not enough people had the cars was because the government owed the private contractor, and so a lot of the cars had been kept without being distributed. But you have to ask yourself the question, why did Parliament even tolerate the notion that without a card you cannot register when we've been doing this democracy for a long time? We know that in the end, the mechanism for identifying people through the guarantee system is the same that people are using to get a Ghana card. The reason, of course, is that the elites themselves have been enchanted. So when this matter came up, the only discussion was the finance ministry must find the money so that the cards will be released so people can go and register. Unfortunately, that did not happen in time for the district assembly elections. And I suppose the CI was then laid the law, which will have required that you only use the Ghana card to register to vote, had then been, had to be laid in Parliament without that provision. So my argument is that the way in which it is framed is such that even the opposition elite does not recognize what is going on, or even if it does, it's completely disabled. Yes. Yes, I have 2 more case studies, then we'll conclude. The second one is the digital addressing. And in the digital addressing also, the presentation that is made often to the public is that, this is purely national policy that is being implemented. And the national policy that is being implemented revolves around all the benefits that you've heard the national addressing will achieve for us in our economy. What was, of course, not obvious to people was that actually this was purely private initiative. Somebody had an app. The person was not able to get enough traction for the private app called Assassin GPS. They managed to get the government to, baptize this app as the national digital addressing system. And then on top of that, give them a contract to do this rebranding at the cost of about $3.5 million. And then when it became very apparent that there was no clear strategy as to how you will get all these benefits that they have been promised in terms of formalization of the economy, the decision was made that it should be transferred to the Ghana Post, but without any receptacle at the Ghana Post to inherit it. What we now know is that the system is still completely controlled by the private company, and that private company is continuing to add profit-making elements to it, like ride-sharing, fintech, etc., which eventually will be launched as if it's a Ghana Post transformation exercise, but in actual fact, it's not a Ghana Post transformation exercise. We also know of the revenue assurance programs, where the revenue assurance benefits are presented to us as if it's purely a matter of the government plugging leakages, plugging leakages in revenue. And yet still, when you analyze it rationally, you come to the conclusion that the solutions don't work. And we can take the case of Kelly GVG, where the principle is that because the telecom companies lie about the volume of calls and the volume of megabytes of data download, the government does not get the revenue deserved because the revenue is tied to the volume of calls and the volume of megabytes of data downloaded. The truth, of course, is that to determine how much a telco has made and therefore the tax it must pay, it's not just the volume, it's also the rates. So what is 1 megabyte? What is a 1 minute or 1 second of a phone call? How much is it costing? And that costing process does not happen in the volumetric dimension. It does not happen by counting the number of calls. It happens in internal software generated by the company. And because the company can give discounts, they can decide to price differently in the evening and the morning. Knowing how many calls have passed through a system, knowing how much megabytes of data have been downloaded, does not actually tell you the revenue that is being generated at all. So technically and logically, any monitoring of phone calls purported to be able to help us with revenue assurance does not make sense. And yes, we pay millions of dollars to Kelly GVG, now the custodian of the national common platform, which people assume to be a national system, but it's actually owned and managed by a private company. And this company makes all this money for absolutely no benefit to the state. They've never been able to move the revenue outing for CST, communication service tax, or anything else. And now we have this issue of SML, where once again we are being told that the likes of the big mining companies and the oil and gas companies are cheating Ghana. And the only way to solve that problem is to integrate some kind of technology using blockchain, X-ray, etc., to prevent them from cheating us. But the truth is that these companies typically are listed on the stock market, and they typically want to convey to that market and to their investors that their production volumes are massive. They have absolutely no benefit and incentive of lying about their production volumes. What they do when they want to cheat on taxes is to overestimate and to exaggerate their costs. By exaggerating their costs, they are able then to benefit from transfer price and other such mechanisms. And yet still this company is on course to make nearly $1 billion over the term of the contract. Last case study is the one regarding the tap and go, which has been presented to the country as an Oyster card for Ghana. And if you paid attention, yes, if you paid attention, you will have noticed that it was presented as a GPRTU project. And the comparison that was made was to the Oyster card in the United Kingdom. And yet still, it turns out that this has nothing to do whatsoever with the GPRTU. They don't own a cent of the company that actually runs it. All the infrastructure, all the intellectual property is held by a complete private company. The same group of companies that were behind projects like Hyperpay that was supposed to enable VIP, which is a private bus company, to be able to digitalize its ticketing operations. And yes, so this has been branded as a national project where we are more or less digitalizing mass transit in Ghana. In short, what has happened over the last couple of years in this country is that most of these aspects of state capture are not even evident to the public. And I bet that most of you sitting in the audience are not familiar with some of these points that I've made around who actually owns these grand national success stories. And I think because it's operated through a mechanism of enchantment, what I would call hypnosis, only a kind of counter-hypnosis will help us to address it. And what is the nature of that tool? I think civil societies have to be, organizations have to be resourced, not necessarily to fight corruption directly, but to enhance overall accountability about government action and about government policy making and about government projects. Without that, my view is that tackling corruption head on, as far as state capture is concerned, will be completely futile and completely useless. Thank you very much.